Yo, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to another Diablo 4 video, and this is a highly requested video on improving your damage drastically and fixing your gearing, because there's a lot of people that are still doing this wrong because the system is pretty complicated. That being said, I'm going to go over every single thing you need to know to take your gearing and your damage and amplify that up about 2 or 3 times at least, 100%. So essentially the way that your damage works in Diablo, before I get into the actual weapons that you're using and the stats, is there are essentially damage buckets in Diablo. And these damage buckets are split up between additive damage and multiplicative damage. So all that means is there's certain stats in here to do with your damage that are going to multiply your damage on top of each other. You're going to essentially multiply that factor of damage times the next factor. And what I mean by this is, let's just take this sword. Let's assume this sword does 2,000 damage. Now overall, the way this works is these damage buckets are split up between a couple of different areas. The primary way you can think of your main damage is split up into the following buckets. So ideally, the first bucket you have is your main stat, or your main stat for your build. For instance, I'm a barbarian, so that's going to be strength. So it's going to be in a bucket completely in its own. And the way the buckets work is each bucket is multiplied times each other to give you an overall damage output. But there are a lot of stats down here that all fall into a singular damage bucket, meaning if you only add stats such as these that are in that singular damage bucket, you're just adding that percentage together, increasing that overall percentage. But if you add percentages to individual buckets, those buckets then multiply times each other and give you a greater damage output that way. So ideally, the damage buckets are split up like this. So ideally, first is your main stat. So your main stat is going to be a primary damage bucket on its own. For instance, for the barbarian, it is strength for me. This core stat is going to act as a modifier to your damage. And this is in its own damage bucket by itself, meaning that bucket is going to multiply times all of the other buckets to give you your overall damage output. Now, additionally, another damage bucket specifically is critical strike damage. So if you've ever had anybody tell you to up this stat, that's because this individual stat for critical strike damage is its own bucket itself. So again, when we take our original strength stat and then we multiply that times our critical strike damage, we're going to get a much higher value overall in terms of our damage and output that we actually do. Now, the next damage bucket after our main stat is going to be overall damage or weapon DPS. So for instance, for this Whirlwind Barbarian build, my main primary item here is going to be a two-handed sword or a two-handed slashing weapon. So that's what we're going to go off of, and that's why DPS overall, especially early, is very important, because your DPS and the number that you get for damage per second is a direct modifier with all of these other stats to give you higher damage. So if this number was 1900 versus 2455, ideally the 2455 would obviously be the better weapon, because it gives you a much higher DPS initially to multiply with all of these other individual damage buckets. So we have strength, which is our main core stat, as a damage bucket. We have, in this case, our slashing weapon damage, or our overall DPS for our weapon, as its own damage bucket again, and those are going to multiply together. Another big damage bucket is going to be our critical strike damage. So if you have a build and you're running a bunch of different stats on it, you want to focus primarily on these 4 buckets. This is one of the stats you want to primarily focus on, and this is because this damage bucket itself, like the other ones, is going to multiply all of the previous buckets in this sequence and give you higher overall damage output from it. So you want to make sure that, for instance, critical strike damage for this build is very, very high. And the example I'll use for this is, let's take these 3 buckets, right? So let me show you an example really quickly before I continue about how these damage buckets work. So let's say we have these 3 individual buckets, right? We have our main core stat bucket, we have our normal weapon DPS bucket, and we have our critical strike damage bucket. Let's say that the first bucket has 1 point in it, right? And then let's say the second bucket, just for easy math, has 2 points in it. And let's say the third bucket, which is critical strike, has 1,000. So because those buckets are multiplicative, what we're going to do is multiply them all. So if you do the 1 times 2, you'll get 2, and then you do the 2 times 1,000, you'll get 2,000. So let's then take half of our critical strike damage that we previously put at 1,000 and take 500 of that and put it in the first bucket. So if we do that, it'll be 3 buckets, the first one with 500, the second one with 2, and the third one with 500. When we do that, we take that 500 and multiply it times 2 to give us 1,000, and then we take that 1,000 and multiply it times 500% to give us an even higher number. You can see by stacking multiple buffs and percentages across buckets, they multiply to give you a much higher number versus having a bunch of stats that all fall into one bucket and it only gives you essentially one big multiplier at the end. You lose a lot of damage this way, and I'll show you how that mistake manifests here in just a moment. So the fourth big bucket is going to be vulnerable damage. So for most builds, you're going to want to stack as much possible percentage wise in critical strike damage and vulnerable damage. And these are two separate buckets on their own. And you can see mine are fairly high in percentage wise. They could be a lot higher for my level, but they're well over both 200%. And the idea here is in order to get perfect weapon rolls or ideal weapon rolls, you want to target weapons that you find that already have a decent amount of these modifiers on them that we're looking for in these different buckets. And then you want to make sure they're pretty much stacked out with those except for maybe one modifier. And then what you can do is re-roll that modifier that you're missing to try and give you 4 or 5 affixes on this weapon. They give you additions to all of those damage buckets, and you want to stack all those damage buckets differently. And that's the way it works ideally, especially for weapons. You want to get affixes for each damage bucket. That way you can bump up the percentages for those individual buckets, giving you an overall higher multiplied damage. You see my two-handed bludgeoning weapon here. I get at the bottom 168 strength, adding to my core stat damage bucket, critical strike damage adding to my critical strike bucket, and vulnerable damage adding to that bucket as well. And because critical strike and vulnerable are so important, as you can see, I have it on every single weapon. The swords automatically come with an affix that gives you critical strike damage. So then on top of that, we get core skill damage, which ends up in its own bucket. We get 76 strength ending up in its own bucket. The all stats goes in the overall stat bucket, so that's fine. That's just an extra bonus. Ideally, you would want another critical strike damage buff there more than likely, and then a vulnerable damage buff that goes in the vulnerable damage bucket. That way you can see I'm spreading my stats and my affixes on each piece of gear over those 4 or 5 buckets. So I don't add to one singular bucket, but I add to multiple buckets so when they multiply, my damage goes through the roof. And you can see it's the same way with the majority of my gear. So this ring is a problem, and not necessarily immediately because I'm using this ring for the aspect that I have on it because I don't have another one to replace it, and it's very important to my build. So overall, in that case, that's perfectly fine. But the affixes on this are definitely a problem, and a lot of people are still running these kind of affixes because they think it's good and because, well, I basically told you it was good. So this ring has vulnerable damage on it, which is great because that's in its own bucket in and of itself, meaning we're going to get that extra damage multiplied with the other buckets, right? So damage to stunned enemies, damage to close enemies, and damage to crowd control enemies. You're looking at those buffs and saying all of those are situational and work with me because all of those apply to enemies that I fight. So I essentially crowd control, fight all close enemies and stunned enemies, just as an example, right? So I get all of those buffs, and if I get all of those buffs, that means this ring is giving me a lot of extra damage and it's good. Well, that's wrong. And that's wrong because damage versus crowd control, you can see here is its own stat. All of these stats down to about with burning, just as an example, all of those stats fall in their own individual damage bucket. So vulnerable damage is its own bucket. Critical strike damage, own bucket. Core stat, own bucket. But these, crowd control, slowed, stunned, close, injured, etc., all fall into one bucket only. Meaning when you stack these stats, you stack that individual bucket very high. But if you were to take some of those percentages and stack them in other buckets as well, by increasing all of those buckets simultaneously, you're getting a much higher damage multiplier because, again, this singular bucket gives additive damage because all of these individual stats add into this one bucket. But what you want to do, again, like is the case on this two-handed bludgeoning weapon, you want to stack each affix as much as you can towards its own bucket and not add a bunch of stats like this on this ring with the close, stunned, and crowd controlled enemies damage into a single bucket, because overall it lowers your damage because when these multiply, you don't get near the output that you should. And for a long time, I was running a two-handed weapon with these stats. But once I ended up switching that to, for instance, this two-handed bludgeoning weapon again, where I stacked my individual damage affixes into multiple buckets like this, and that multiplication started happening across the buckets, I started going from seeing 30k, 20k, 40k crits to 500, 600, 700k crits, and overall way more damage. So just changing these individual affixes and understanding the buckets and how that system works to multiply your damage instead of just add percentages to your damage. But the affixes on your gear are going to make or break your damage overall because you can put an aspect on anything once you find it, but your affixes are very hard to get perfect or as you want them, but they are almost vital to get once you start getting higher in level. And you don't need the perfect setup by any means. You need to also make sure that you're upgrading your weapons to their entirety as much as you can, because as you do that, You can see just from upgrading this hammer, I'm getting 0.42% on vulnerable damage, 3.8% on my critical damage, and overall by upgrading your gear and making sure it's maxed upgraded past level 60s or 70s, because you're not swapping out your gear as much, especially gear with great rolls like this, you can get sometimes like 40% to each additional stat by just upgrading your individual weapons to 5 versus like 2 or 3. Make sure you guys like the video and check out one of the videos on the left or the right for more awesome Diablo 4 content. Go out there and do some damage. Thank you guys.